This is the assembly video for our gearboxes. We will be assembling a 77775 gearbox in the low ratio, but this assembly video also works for our dual-sim gearbox and for all the ratios, as the only differences are the shaft sizes and a couple of the gear sizes, but the assembly is still the same. This is what's included with our gearboxes. You get an output and an input plate, as well as your output gear and your smaller output gear, as well as the gear that meshes with the pinions coming off your motors. You have your intermediate shaft hardware, bearings, and intermediate shaft. These change in size depending on whether it's a 77775 gearbox or a dual-sim gearbox. Then you have your output shaft hardware, bearings, and output shaft. Then we have our standoffs and standoff bolts, as well as a 1/2 inch long, 1/2 inch hex spacer. Also included with the gearboxes, depending on which one you get, will be your pinions for your 775s or your pinions for your Cims, and the required hardware to attach those types of motors to the input plate of the gearbox. To begin assembly of the gearboxes, we're going to need a 5/32 hex key and an 1/8 inch hex key. And to start, we'll be attaching our standoffs to one side. We'll start with the input side. So we can take one of our flathead 1032s, put it into the countersunk side of the gearbox, and thread on our standoff. They don't need to be overly tight right now, just enough to put them together and hold them sturdy. All right, now that we have these standoffs installed, we can start setting up our shaft hardware. So our output shaft, we are going to have our output shaft 1/2 inch long 1/4-20 screw and the washer. We're going to thread it into one side. And we can take one of our bearings for the output shaft and install it so the flange is towards the inside. We'll sit like this. We'll put that there. And we can also take our, at this time, we can also take our 1/2 inch hex spacer and put it on the output shaft as well. And then for the input shaft, same thing. You take your input shaft, screw, and washer, thread them into the input shaft. And then take your bearing and put it so it's flanged to the inside of the shaft, so there's no flange facing the outside. Now what we can do is install these in an order like this. So we'll have our first bearing, we'll sit here. Next is our gear, and here you want to install the output shaft bearing underneath this gear, just so it doesn't block your way later on. So now your gearbox will look like this. Push that bearing the rest of the way in. Now we can take our smaller output gear, put it on top of that. Our larger output gear that goes down on our output shaft. Get those to mesh together. install the bearings on both of these shafts, and we can install the hardware here. And again, make sure that the flange is towards the inside. So here, same thing, flange to the inside towards facing the gear. And install our shaft hardware just so it doesn't fall apart. Next, we can take our output plate and set it over the gearbox and snap the bearings into place. Next, we can take the remaining standoff screws and start threading them in to the standoffs. You just start them by hand and we'll finish them up with the hex key in a second. All right. And then we can take our 1/8 inch hex key and go around and just finish threading them in. And we can go around and snug them all up. Snug. Now is also when you want to flip the gearbox over and make sure that you got these bolts snug over here as well. We do recommend Loctiting these bolts before final installation, just so that nothing comes loose when they are hidden in the robot. But even when this gearbox is installed, only either this side or this side, the bottom 2 screws will not be available to tighten. Everything else will be sticking up over top of the rail. We can tighten up the intermediate shaft bolts. And there's our gearbox, fully assembled, ready to be attached to a drive rail. Now, if you notice, looking at from the front of the gearbox, you can still access all the holes to attach your motors. And it's the same for the dual-sim gearbox. As well as, if you notice, there is a pattern on the front and back of the gearbox, so they can be mounted either drive rail on this side or drive rail on this side of the gearbox to have the motors hang either way. You also notice that the smaller holes inside are 1032, and this is for a encoder mount to sit. If the drive rail was on this side, you can put the encoder mount across here directly on the back of this output shaft. That concludes the assembly video for our line of gearboxes.